Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lunch with the League. We are doing our second virtual luncheon today, and I want to thank you all for your patience with us as we learn this new technology and we get started with this programming. I think the last one that we did was very interesting, and it was on plea bargaining, and I think we did a pretty substantial job of covering the bases and taking your questions, and so we hope to do at least as well with this luncheon today, and perhaps even better, and have more audience participation interaction as well. So I'm Lori Thiel, president of the League of Women Voters here in San Diego, and I want to welcome you all, our attendees and our panelists. I also want to thank you all for donating. I don't know if you recall, but our last luncheon we were graciously hosted by ACLU. They shared with us their Zoom technology and webinar subscription, and they also helped us learn how to manage and administer it. So since then, we've purchased our own. And so your donations are going a long way towards helping us bring you this programming. So I really want to thank you for your donations and support for us and our work here. I want to take a moment to mention our upcoming events. We have an event this Saturday, May 9th at 10 a.m. It's called Global Warming and Food Waste. It's going to be a virtual event just like this one. It's our monthly meetup. And so we'll be discussing a TED Talk entitled 100 Solutions to Reverse Global Warming. And that information and a link to that talk are also on our website and on our social media. If you go to our Facebook events page or Eventbrite to sign up for that, you'll be able to see that and register for that meetup and get the link to Zoom in with us. We also have another luncheon this month. Now that we've gotten rolling, we're just doing all kinds of stuff. So our second luncheon for May is May 27th. That's our regularly scheduled time. As you might remember, we usually do the last Wednesday in May. The title of that one is Ending Hunger Through Food Rescue, and it will be featuring the president of Feeding San Diego, Vince Hall, and Ellie Brown from San Diego Food Systems. And they'll be talking to us about food insecurity and how food can help make, food rescue can help end hunger here in San Diego. So we're really excited about that. In addition to those events, we are continuing our committee meetings. We're doing those virtually as well. And you'll see if you go to our website and click calendar, the meetings that we have scheduled throughout the month for our committees. So I invite you to go to our website and just keep up with the things that we're doing and take advantage of the opportunities to join us virtually on all of our events and committee meetings. Today, we're gonna go through some of the technology, and Kim, who's with our program committee, she's gonna talk us through it right now and give you an idea of how we're gonna collect questions and when and how you can participate. So Kim.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Kim Knox, and I'm the program co-chair with the League of Women Voters of San Diego. We'll begin the discussion in a moment, but before we get started, I'd like to go over some housekeeping rules. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with the public through our website. If you are having trouble hearing or seeing the information provided, please send us a message using the chat icon on your Zoom screen, or send an email to program@lwvsandiego.org. All participants' microphones will remain muted. Instructions regarding how to submit questions will be provided after the speakers have made their concluding remarks. Now back to Lori.
Thanks, Kim. Well, so back to the topic here today, I just wanted to let you all know that, as you might be well aware, this topic was originally planned for a prior luncheon. And the reason we're hosting two luncheons in this month is because we had to accommodate the lockdown orders and the stay and or shelter in place orders. And so we were unable to host that at its original time, but we're delighted to be able to bring it to you today. We pulled back together the original panelists that we had aligned to have this discussion. And so today we're going to be talking about the status of women in the United States from the ratification of the 19th Amendment to today, and ERA and all the things that women are doing to gain equal access and equity and equality. So I'm going to start by introducing the woman who's going to be running this discussion today. This is Ann Hoiberg, and her work in women's rights and women's issues is just so astoundingly storied and long. You'll just have to bear with me as I just go through all of her accomplishments. She's just a very involved and active individual when it comes to women's issues. So Ann, as many of you might know, is a longtime leader with the League of Women Voters. She's a former league president, and she now serves as International Relations Chair on our board. She's also the president of the Women's Museum of California at Liberty Station, and she's the founder of the Ann Hoiberg Women's Center at the Women's Museum. That Women's Center offers Speakers Bureau opportunities, walking tours, a Girl Scout badge program, and other informative events. She served on a community-wide task force to create the San Diego Family Justice Center. And for 24 years, she has been a member of a San Diego delegation at the annual meeting of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. She started her career as a research psychologist at the Naval Health Research Center in Point Loma, where she worked for 25 years. During that time, she published more than 100 papers at and presented at scientific conferences on women's health issues, women in the military, domestic violence, alcohol abuse, stress-related disease, and the role of the military in society. She wrote 2 books and became a certified instructor on the prevention of sexual harassment. Ann has conducted training workshops at international women's rights conferences. She organized a week-long symposium for NATO on women in the world of work for scientists in Lisbon, Portugal. She led workshops on women and political participation at AWID in Washington, D.C., the 4th World Conference on Women in Beijing, China, and the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa. She also led the workshop Trafficking in Women and Children at the International Women's Congress in Havana, Cuba. In recognition of her work, Ann was appointed an election supervisor for the U.S. Department of State and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe during elections in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, Belarus, and Ukraine between 1997 and 2004. In addition to her international work, there's more people it just continues. She has headed the local chapters of the National Women's Political Caucus and the United Nations Association. She has served as president of Incredible Women Television. She serves as president of La Jolla Penn Women, International Museum of Human Rights at San Diego, Nile Sisters Development Initiative, and Bilateral Safety Corridor Coalition. She served on the board of directors of Voices for Women, Bilateral Safety Corridor Coalition, ACLU and World Affairs Council, and American Association of University Women. She was the director of the United Nations Association on Women's Equity Council from 1989 to 2009. She also has been a member of the California Women's Agenda, San Diego Opera Association, Interagency Coalition for Human and Civil Rights, Older Women's League, and Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And as president of the Women's Museum of California, she has created an installation called Marching Toward Empowerment in honor of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment that granted women the right to vote. So, and I know you asked me to shorten that and make it less long, but I didn't even say all the things that you've been involved in. So I hope I didn't embarrass you or overwhelm our attendees, but I just really wanted to share with everyone the scope of your work in women's rights and women's issues as we get started on this. And so with that, Ann, take it away. The presentation is yours.
So, Kim, would you take it to the first slide? Second slide. Okay, we're going to start back in the 1700s, actually. We're going back to 1776 when America created its Declaration of Independence. And in that declaration, it stated that we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Well, what was left out of that Declaration of Independence? Well, Elizabeth Cady Stanton created her own Declaration of Sentiments, and she included women where they belonged. Well, starting in 1777, each of the 13 states adopted the British common law, and they all voted against women getting the right to vote. So by 1807, all states, all 13 states had disallowed women the right to vote. So let's start out now with what Elizabeth Cady Stanton did in the next slide. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a suffragist and abolitionist. All Quakers were really concerned about ending slavery in our country, and she was one of them. And she and her husband on their honeymoon went to London, and they attended the World Anti-Slavery Convention in 1840. Unfortunately, women were not allowed. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her friend Lucretia Mott sat in the park outside the convention and discussed what they were going to do when they came back to America. And so they returned and decided to create the Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights convention in 1848. Okay, next slide. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton did create that Declaration of Sentiments, and she wrote down all the things that troubled women in 1848. And women wanted the right to vote. They weren't allowed to vote in those states. They also wanted representation. They wanted to be able to get a divorce, to go to college, to become members of the professions of law, medicine, and religion. So the most controversial at that convention was women getting the right to vote. And even Frederick Douglass stood up and spoke out that, yes, women need the right to vote. Next slide. Now, Susan B. Anthony did not attend the Seneca Falls Convention. She was an abolitionist. She was working in the temperance movement. But her main issue back in 1848 was she learned that she was making less money than her male counterparts as school teachers, less pay than men. She was outraged. So this was the beginning of women's issues in getting equal pay. So not only did Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony fight for women getting the right to vote, but there were other issues. Even during the Civil War, they managed to collect 400,000 petitions to end slavery in this country. Those women were dynamite, fighting for all issues of importance to all of us. Next slide. Now, it's important for women to be elected to office. This is crucial to all of us. And it's important for us to eventually have a woman president of our country. And the first woman presidential candidate was Victoria Woodhull. And she ran on her own party, the Equal Rights Party. Next slide. Now, equal pay for equal work has been with us since the beginning. And here is a float from 1910 that was in a Labor Day parade here in San Diego. Women wanted equal pay for equal work. What a concept. Okay, next slide. Now here in San Diego, we had the most wonderful woman heading up the Equal Suffrage Association. Now, Dr. Charlotte Baker would work delivering babies in the morning, and then in the afternoon, she would work on her civic duties. And one of those was getting women the right to vote. It was on our ballot in 1896. It went down to defeat. Even Susan B. Anthony led the campaign here in California, but as I said, it went down to defeat in 1896. It was on our ballot again in 1911, and Dr. Charlotte Baker and her cadre of women were determined that women would get the right to vote, and it was successful. In 1911, California became the 6th state to grant women the right to vote. I would like to mention that Dr. Charlotte Baker delivered over 1,000 babies without losing the life of the mother. That was unheard of in the 1880s and the early 1900s. The second leading cause of death was childbirth. Okay, next slide. Oh, and we all know Carrie Chapman Catt, the founder of the League of Women Voters. She worked really hard to get women the right to vote. Amazingly, she was the only girl in her high school class in Mason City, Iowa. And she was a valedictorian, of course, and went on to become the superintendent of schools at the age of 24. Susan B. Anthony spotted her and asked her to head up the National American Woman Suffrage Association, which she did twice, and she really led the cause in 1915. Another dynamite woman during that era was Alice Paul on the next slide. And there she is. And Alice Paul not only had a PhD, but she also had a JD. And most important to all of us right now is the fact that in 1923, she wrote the Equal Rights Amendment. And she presented it in Seneca Falls in 1923, and it was the 75th anniversary of the Seneca Falls Convention. She presented the Equal Rights Amendment. We needed that in our Constitution. She made sure equal rights was in the UN Charter in 1945, and she did create the National Woman's Party, and I happen to be a member of the National Woman's Party, and it would be wonderful if we could really become a force in this country. Next slide. Now, at the same time women were working on these important issues, another key issue was peace. And in 1915, several women, and as a matter of fact, it was 47 women, boarded a ship and they went to the Netherlands and they went to The Hague, and they were determined that they were going to meet with the kings and the chancellors in Europe to end World War I. So these two women were part of that delegation. And they did meet with the kings and the chancellors of the countries of Europe and told them that they had to stop World War I. There was no point in going to war. And for their good work, both of these women did receive the Nobel Peace Prize, Jane Addams in 1931 and Emily Balich in 1946. Both women dedicated their lives to ending war. And this is still a key women's issue. We must end war. Okay, next slide. Jeanette Rankin was another pacifist, and she was elected to the House of Representatives in 1916, and one of her issues was to vote against the U.S. getting into World War I. She was the only member of our Congress to vote against that. She was defeated the following year. She went back to Montana and worked on the Equal Rights Amendment and also getting equal pay for equal work. Another key issue, as we all know. She ran again in 1940 and again voted against the U.S. going into World War II. A truly dedicated pacifist. She was asked to lead the Vietnam War protest in 1968, and there was a Jeanette Rankin brigade of 5,000 women who protested against being in the Vietnam War. Next slide. Now, also during the Great Depression, we had Frances Perkins working hard for issues that really are women's issues. Well, how do we survive after we retire or when we get into older age? So we needed Social Security. And she really was the brainchild behind creating most of these legislative endeavors for our country. She worked on creating the 40-hour week. She prevented children from having to work in the mines. And when she retired, she was appointed to become head of the Civil Service Commission, a woman dedicated to ensuring that all of us had equal rights and opportunity. Next slide. Eleanor Roosevelt was asked by President Harry Truman if she would go to the UN and work there on behalf of the United States. And while there, she headed the Human Rights Commission. And what they created was a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What are the human rights that we all have? And of course, the most important one that I can think of from that declaration is that we all have the human right to an adequate standard of living, which includes housing, medical care, and education. What could be better? Now, this UDHR was to serve as a standard for countries to create their own constitutions, their own laws. And we here in the US, our legislators created human rights laws that we all adhere to now. So she claimed that this was the most important work she had done, this creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We all have a right to an education. We all have a right to a nationality. And what she created is just remarkable and what we needed. Next slide. Now, back in 1963, Betty Friedan came out with the Feminine Mystique. And I don't know how many of you have read the book, but it was astonishing to me. And so she started the women's liberation movement, and she certainly had help from Gloria Steinem. And Steinem was very instrumental in creating Ms. Magazine that most of us subscribe to, and we keep up on what's going on as far as our rights and opportunities are concerned. So next slide. Now, as I've been mentioning, we've all been working on getting equal pay for equal work, and the pursuit continues. But Edith Green was elected to the House of Representatives after she completed college. She really wanted to become an engineer, but she was told, no, girls don't become engineers, they become school teachers. So she became a school teacher, and then she was elected to the House of Representatives from Oregon. Now, she fought hard. She spent 8 years promoting the Equal Pay Act of 1963. You cannot pay men more than you pay women for the same job. That's the point of the Equal Pay Act of 1963. We also have seen pictures of JFK signing this bill into law with women surrounding him. All the women are wearing hats and gloves. It's a wonderful picture. But Edith Green is the brainchild behind this, the Equal Pay Act of 1963. Next slide. Now, another amazing woman who represented us. Now, it's important when we take on an issue, when we women take on an issue, we need somebody to help implement the laws that are created. And most of the laws based on our issues have been created by women. So that's another reason we need more women elected to office. And I'll continue to urge Lori and Kim to run for office. I'll become the pesterer of the year. Anyway, Martha Griffiths was involved in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, in the Civil Rights Act, Title VII addresses discrimination, primarily on the job. And what Title VII originated was you cannot discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, or national country of origin. Those 4 issues. Well, Martha Griffith thought it would be important to include sex in there, or gender. Well, when it was discussed on the House on the floor of the House of Representatives, the men all laughed. What? Include sex? Why would you do that? And so she scolded the men and said, no, we need to include this. And then the segregationists thought, well, if we include sex, then it'll go down to the feet. Well, it didn't. It was passed. And we have Martha Griffiths to really thank for pushing this through, that you cannot discriminate against women, particularly in the workplace. Title VII. Now here she's standing in front of the steps of the Capitol, introducing the Equal Rights Amendment. Next slide. Now, Patsy Mink was involved in Title IX. Now, Title IX is another important part of the educational amendments. And it says that schools cannot spend more money on boys than they can on girls. So this really created a bonanza for girls going into sports, going on to higher education, getting scholarships. It was phenomenal. And we have Patsy Mink to thank for that. And so Title IX continues. Thank you very much, Patsy Mink. And at San Diego State, through funding from Title IX, they've created the most comprehensive program to end rape and sexual assault on their campus. So programs related to ending rape and sexual assault on college campuses came out of this Title IX, this important part of the educational amendments. Next slide. Another important issue, another women's issue, is childcare. How can women go to work and pay for childcare if they have children? Now, a friend of mine pays $1,500 a month for her little 2-year-old girl, childcare. This is an amazing amount of money for childcare. Well, back in 1972, Shirley Chisholm and Bella Abzug, so let's turn up the next slide, created the Comprehensive Child Development Bill. And this was to provide federally sponsored childcare centers for working mothers. What could be better? And it was passed in both our House and in our Senate. And then it went to the office of President Nixon, and he was supposed to either sign it or veto it. And his speechwriters had prepared 2 speeches for him. One if he vetoed it and one if he accepted it and signed it. Well, he vetoed this important comprehensive child development bill. And his rationale for defeating this, even though it had been approved by both houses of Congress, was that it would Sovietize our children if we had child care centers all over the country. Amazingly appalling. Next slide. Now, Roe v. Wade, another important women's issues, another important women's right. And these 2 women, Sarah Weddington and Linda Coffey, created the Roe v. Wade legislation. And Sarah Weddington argued this before the U.S. Supreme Court, and it was approved, and it is the law of the land. Unfortunately, we now have 4 states. There are 8 states that are trying to ban abortion in their states. There are 475 pieces of legislation passed by various states putting restrictions on the original Roe v. Wade. So this is another women's issue, another women's rights that we need to really protect. Next slide. Pat Schroeder. Oh, Pat Schroeder, she worked hard to get the Family and Medical Leave Act implemented. Now, when she first went to Congress, the FBI created a surveillance of her office. And they went into her office to, if she was leaning toward communism or whatever. And she reported in her book, and the title of her book is 24 Years of Housework and the Place is Still a Mess. So she served for 24 years in the House of Representatives. And she said in that book that the FBI, during their surveillance, they found a dues statement from the League of Women Voters. Can you imagine? And she when she told that story, she had to chuckle. And she and her husband went ahead and they retired to Florida. And currently she serves on the board of the League of Women Voters of Florida. And I'd love to hear more of her stories. Next slide. Okay, we're going to shift gears now. We've reached the point in my presentation where I'm up to 1995. So I'm going to introduce my dear friend, Dr. D. Aker, and let me just read a little bit of some important information about Dee. She is a psychological anthropologist and conflict resolution professional with more than 40 years of experience in peace building and conflict transformation in international settings. She originally was inspired by her early Peace Corps volunteer experience, and then her career path led her to social work in Los Angeles with the elderly and the disabled in the Hispanic community. And she also included her work teaching and serving as director of the United States International University Africa in Kenya. So she was working and heading up that university in Kenya. She served as a producer and host of Women on KUSI, presenting 235 programs on women pioneers and survivors. For 3 years, she wrote a column entitled In Human Terms for San Diego's Women's Times. Do any of you remember that wonderful newspaper, the Women's Times? When I started reading that, I started clipping out all of these articles. So she's been a friend of mine since 1995 when we all went together to the Fourth World Conference on Women. She served as a member of the founding leadership of the Joan B. Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice in 2000. And during her time there until 2017, she created the Women Peacemakers Program and also the World Link program that brought together high school youth from Mexico and the United States. She led the 15-year Nepal Peace Building Initiative, which supported local Nepali people in ending conflict and building peace during and after their civil conflict and post-Civil War challenges. So she served in that capacity from 2001 to 2017. I welcome Dr. D. Aker. Next slide.
Thank you, Anne. And thanks to our heroes, the League of Women Voters. I mean, this is pretty exciting. I will quickly take you from Anne's honor roll of U.S. pioneer women through our global coming together for rights and justice, from Eleanor working there to get human rights here, to get human rights into the UN, and then from the UN picking up and focusing on the women all the way through the Fourth World Conference in Beijing and beyond. Don't worry, this is short. But Eleanor's work in making human rights integral to the United Nations ran parallel to the creation of the UN Commission on the Status of Women in 1946. The CSW was established especially to promote the advancement and rights of women throughout the world. And they held their first meeting in 1947, just a year before our actual UN human rights document was out. In 1975, there was the first global conference of women at the United Nations. And it took place, when it took place in Mexico City, about 25% of the delegates were men. The conference chair was a man. And the many women delegates were spouses of very powerful men around the world who came together. And while it was the highest number of women delegates ever at a UN event, all the delegates were told to be representatives of their government's ideological agendas rather than their private, let's read that, feminist convictions. In 1979, an international treaty which calls for the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women was articulated by the United Nations General Assembly. CEDAW is the International Bill of Rights for Women and was instituted on the 3rd of September, 1981. It's now been ratified by 189 nations, but not the United States. That's on our to-do list for today. Parallel with the treaty efforts in 1980, the second World Conference on Women was held in Denmark. And while more women were engaged in the conference, chair was a woman, the loudest voice remained official government delegates on official government policy. While primary interests on health and education could be talked about, issues of control of property, rights to inheritance, child custody got mired in the North-South and socialist versus capitalist tensions. In 1985, many more diverse people gathered in Nairobi, Kenya for the third World Conference, UN Conference on Women. There, indeed, a majority of official women came as delegates, a little bit more latitude in their speaking, plus thousands more individuals representing non-governmental organizations and ordinary women who were more organized turned up for this event. Including, there was the first real effort to focus on violence against women on a international level. It took 10 more years before the great international explosion of rights demands brought forward by non-governmental folk pushed forward and helped move a real international conference, the Fourth World Conference on Women. For 17 rainy days in August and September in 1995, there were a number of people from all different countries. They were very different and very special. We're going to show you a short video that I made when I came home. Believe me, I found this in the bottom of the drawer. It's very old and fuzzy, but I hope you get a feeling for what it was like and who was there and the kinds of people who came. Yeah, thanks. You do the video.
Women, thousands from 189 nations, as well as indigenous peoples, gathered in 1995. They convened in China to be sure their voices were heard at the United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women. Colorful and powerful in their respect and commitment to one another, they held the largest and most successful coming together ever of diverse and marginalized people. Stepping across borders and out of the shadows, they came to lead governments down new paths of dignity and serenity for families and communities. And who were these pioneers? Farmers, teachers, union workers, businesswomen, parliamentarians and householders, mothers, daughters, and great-grandmothers, Quakers and Hindus and Christians and Baha'is and Jews and Muslims and Buddhists, and those deeply spiritual in unlabeled ways. They were 16, 35, 54, and 87 years old, women at the beginnings and ends of their lives. They'd survived revolutions, rape, refugee camps, being sold into sexual slavery. They'd come from the minefields where their families continue to be blown up, from towns where nuclear waste is slowly killing them, from lands made into deserts by policies they could not stop. They came from countries where genocide and economic abuse has left them homeless. Why did they come? To learn, to offer their experience and wisdom, and to stand side by side because they share the common experiences of nursing babies, caring for the dying, holding their families together. And they were tired of being the ones called upon to put civilization back together only after the wars they did not start finally end. They want to stop the killing games before they begin. So they must speak now, before their daughters are asked to sell vegetables or their bodies at ever younger ages instead of going to school, or their sons are sent to yet another meaningless fight, or just disappear. These women had to come, and men joined them. They protest in unison, remembering those who could not come, speaking to higher values than materialism and patriarchy and other selfishness. They risked learning and speaking the truth. They established a platform for action, for a compassionate, wise world, a world to be created by looking down the road, by demanding personal responsibility. They wanted to assure a future for this tiny, fragile green and blue planet. They demonstrated they care about what happens to their children and all the children of the earth. After 17 days they left, taking the second step of a journey of 1,000 miles. They went to their homes, communities, nations to create a new awareness of how our world could be a peaceful one, like one they built in 17 days together at the end of a violent century. They moved forward to work, teach, and lead, committed to sustainable development, peace, equality, and respect for all humankind. Join them.
So we can cut. Yeah, before I get on to that, that's nice because there's a picture of Hillary there. For over 2 weeks, we survived that rain, lack of facilities, all kinds of criticism, language barriers, and Rush Limbaugh. That was the time of the terminology feminist Nazi, Nazi feminist or whatever he used, as did Hillary Clinton, who was there. On September 6, 1995, Anne Hoiberg and I stood in a very cold rain just outside an auditorium in Huairou in China. That was the area 20 miles outside the city of Beijing where most of the people were. We shivered, but with smiles because it was transformational. And by some strange quirk of fate, Anne and I, carrying press passes, ended up in the entourage of Hillary Clinton, who had captured the importance of this moment for ordinary women's demands and influence. Hillary, with thousands standing in the rain, some few inside the small building they had available, listened to her saying, and I quote, "In addition to the weather, which is not in anyone's control and is always unpredictable, I know that you have had to endure severe frustrations here as you've pursued your work. And I want to particularly recognize women with disabilities who have faced these profound trials. But I mostly want to thank you all for the perseverance, because you did not give up. You did not stay away. You are here. And the fact that you are will make a difference in the days and months and years to come. The wisdom that is accumulated here, the experiences, the energy, the ideas are on full display. Thanks to your resourcefulness, your tenacity, your sense of purpose, your spirit, you are playing an important role in this conference, and you will be the key players in determining whether or not this conference goes beyond the rhetoric. And though you may not be physically present with us in Beijing at the conference during these days, she said, the wisdom that is accumulated here, the experience of and the energy and the ideas are on full display, thanks to your resourcefulness, your tenacity, your sense of purpose, and your spirit. You're playing an important role. So back in Beijing, Anne and I were hearing amazing speakers, global leaders, human rights defenders, many of whom, like Hillary, were also bringing the words of the global village out of town, gathered there in Huairou, back to the table. The NGO Forum on Women called for us to look at the world through women's eyes and move forward, assuring the inclusion of women's voices on all our human search for rights and justice. The government's participating countries finally did adopt a Beijing platform for action. With the action came and the ideas came so much from Huairou. It's inspired us and changed our world. This document offered an agenda to advance women's rights and remove the obstacles, just checking here. It affirmed equality between women and men as a matter of human rights and a condition for social justice in governments and the international community. And the civil society were all called to take real strategic action. I just want to share 2 points from Beijing Declaration here. Point 13 from the declaration itself said that women's empowerment and their full participation on the basis of equality in all spheres of society, including participation in decision-making process and access to power, are fundamental for the achievement of equality, development, and peace. Such directives encourage the global increase of women in government. Rwanda has 61% now of people in government. And the actual world representation seats in parliament are about 25%, up from 11% back in 1995. And of course, the UN actually moved up a little bit too. And then, of course, in 2018, we moved up to about 23, just over 23%, which was higher than we've been. But still not even up to, I think we're about 74th in the world on the number of people in our government. So the second point I want to mention from the declaration is that it's a process thing that becomes very important for us. The second point is that it's essential to design, implement, and monitor with full participation of women effective, efficient, and mutually enforcing gender-sensitive policies and programs, including development policies and programs at all levels that will foster and empower women. And you've got the list of things up here already, where you can see that the 12 critical areas of concern that came from the conference on the Platform for Action had to do with women in poverty, education and training, women health, violence. I'm sure you've had time to read this by now, but I really want to accent the last one, the girl child. We thank Africa greatly for having that be part of the agenda, the critical concerns, and it's made a huge difference in the world. It's now that used to be in 1995 that 1 in 4 children will be married below marriage age or a very young child. It's now 1 in 5, not a lot better, but that's better. And with female genital mutilation, the numbers have dropped also from 47% in 31 countries that practice this to down to 34%, and it's headed down. This wouldn't even be considered if we hadn't had the impact from people who were not official government delegates. So the Platform for Action did change our lives, and Ann and I have watched this and participated at the United Nations, almost all of the annual conferences on the status of women that are promoted to push these forward. We know each area they pick a few, they follow up, they see what's going on. You work on those areas when you go. So it made a difference. And following the conference in 1995, there was another statement that we changed, or we participated in and made an effort to actually pay attention to, and that was that 19th point that I mentioned about it's essential to design, implement, monitor with full participation of women, effective, efficient, and mutually reinforcing gender-sensitive policies and programs. Right after Beijing, President Clinton created the women's, can we go back to that slide that was too back, Kim? Yeah, that one, yeah. The Interagency Council on Women in 1995. That was essential because it asked every department in our government to start paying attention. They had to monitor it, they had to look at it, they had to do something about it. Unfortunately, the Interagency Council was immediately shut down when Bush came in, but it made a difference. It was there for almost 5 years. There were people who were very active, among the people that Ann has mentioned, we're also participating in doing work on this particular area. So internationally, all of the work of the United Nations opened many doors. And finally, there are a number of other items that we should take time to talk about, maybe just the Security Council resolution, which was passed in called 1325, and it stressed the importance of women equal and full participation. There are more resolutions from the Security Council that have passed since and on women specifically, and they've really been important. For example, just one that's important to me in my work at various points in my life had to do with making sure that women peacekeepers could be allowed, because we see the difference when women are participating in a peacekeeping mission of the total capacity for the humanity that has to be addressed at the same moment, if you're gonna be a peace builder. Anyway, the UN became an arm of the United Nations in 2010. We don't have to wait for some big world conference or event now to take care of things. And I just want to say that while COVID-19 prevented the 64th meeting of the Commission on the Status of Women, it does not stop the work, the heart, the promise of what we can do together. And with that, I'll turn this back to Ann. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Dee. So let's move forward to talking about violence against women. Now, I did mention that the United Nations tries to present a standard for all countries to work on legislation. And one of the important declarations that was created at the United Nations was a declaration on the elimination of violence against women. And it identifies what is violence against women. It's not just in the home, domestic violence. It is in our communities, and our countries engage in violence against women. Now, out of that, here in the US, Joe Biden was instrumental in creating the Violence Against Women Act of 1993. It went through lots of amendments, lots of changes, and finally in 1994, Joe Biden and Orrin Hatch presented the Violence Against Women Act of 1994. And that was accepted and signed into law. So we do have here in the US a Violence Against Women Act. Now there's also been a convention created through the Organization of American States, and that was created in 1994, also based on that declaration from 1993. However, the US has not signed on to that declaration. And the Council of Europe created its own convention for the countries there, and that also is a prevention of violence against women. It typically includes protection, prevention, and prosecution. And Hillary Rodham Clinton wanted to also include partnerships that we all of our organizations and civil society work together. Rutgers University created its 16 Days of Activism Against Gender Violence. That's held every year. All cities, all states are encouraged to participate. It begins November 25th and ends Human Rights Day on December 10th. Next slide. So this is what came out of the Declaration of the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And as you can see, it's very comprehensive. We have violence in our homes, in our communities, and certainly nationally. And I think the Me Too campaign has really addressed the issue of sexual harassment and sexual assault in the workplace. But that's not all forms of violence against women. It's everywhere. And this is what we also need to address. So next slide. And human trafficking and sex trafficking, another set of laws that went into effect here in the US back in 2000. The last piece of legislation that President Clinton signed was the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. And since then, we've been working on the reauthorization of funding for this. The TIP report includes our Department of State looking at what countries are doing to end human and sex trafficking. And then it lists those countries that are doing nothing. They're in Tier 2 or Tier 3 of that TIP report. It comes out every year. All you have to do is go to the Department of State website and look to see what countries are included there. What was exciting is in 2005, the United States signed on to the Palermo Protocol, which addresses how all countries should come together and end human and sex trafficking. And we here in San Diego held a press conference to announce that the United States had joined the Palermo Protocol. And that was pretty exciting. Okay, next slide. So here in San Diego, we're fortunate that we have the San Diego Family Justice Center. And we're fortunate to have with us today Yvette Lopez-Cooper, and she is the executive director of the San Diego Family Justice Center. And that is a local governmental agency dedicated to transforming victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and sex trafficking into survivors. That's their mission. As the executive director, Yvette leads a team of 19 on-site community partners, including community-based organizations, attorneys, therapists, domestic violence advocates, police detectives, prosecutors, and forensic medical nurses. Prior to leading the Family Justice Center, Yvette practiced immigration and nationality law. She was an attorney advisor for the Department of Justice, has taught law school classes in the US and Latin America, and has presented on law and public policy at academic institutions, think tanks, and governmental fora. So I welcome now Yvette Lopez-Cooper. Yvette?
Yes. Thank you, Anne. Thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this Zoom webinar on this important topic. And thank you also to the League of Women Voters for bringing awareness to these important issues. I'm honored to be here. I would like to start with a disclaimer. Although I work for the City of San Diego and the City Attorney's Office, I'll be speaking for myself during this presentation based on my own opinions, and the opinions expressed in this presentation do not represent those of my employer. So as Anne mentioned, I will be speaking about the work of the San Diego Family Justice Center and how these laws that we are talking about this morning, like the Violence Against Women Act and other important landmark legislation, has really opened the door for organizations like the one that I am part of to help women who are going through really challenging times. And also, I just want to mention that although our work focuses on domestic violence, as we all know, domestic violence affects all genders, men, women, children, families. But for purposes of this presentation, I will be focusing on the impact that domestic violence has had on women. So since July 2018, the Family Justice Center has been part of the San Diego City Attorney's Office. And as Anne mentioned, we provide services to survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. And in January 2019, our services were expanded to include assisting survivors of sex trafficking. The San Diego Family Justice Center was the first center in the United States of its kind. It was a model at the time, and today it continues to be studied by government institutions, nonprofits, healthcare organizations, and other community agencies around the country and the globe. In fact, prior to the pandemic, we would have numerous visitors that were organized, that were coming on State Department visits, foreign visitors and dignitaries from around the world to learn about our model and also to share best practices on how we can prevent domestic violence, sexual assault, and sex trafficking. There are more than 100 family justice centers in the United States and numerous FJCs worldwide. The idea is to provide as many services in one location for survivors to bring down the barriers that so often prevent them from getting the help that they need. And at our center, we provide free services for survivors throughout the San Diego region. And I will expand a little later on the exact services that we provide, but just to give you a sense of what we do, we collaborate with nonprofit social service providers, law enforcement, attorneys, forensic medical nurses, to provide free services to victims and survivors. The current pandemic, however, has created significant impacts negative impacts on survivors. Isolation orders around the globe are compounding the risk for women who are not safe at home. We are hearing stories of individuals in serious situations, such as being strangled at home by their abusers, their children being abducted by their abuser, individuals with developmental disabilities suffering from domestic abuse, and other horrific situations. Domestic violence has not stopped during the pandemic. Instead, the pandemic, COVID-19, has only amplified the situation. Domestic violence has always been a crisis, not only in San Diego, but around the world. And it's important for us to get the message out to women who are hearing us and who are suffering in silence that despite isolation orders and lockdown orders, they do not have to stay in dangerous situations, and that there is help for them throughout San Diego. Women may be stuck at home with their abusers, and it is not safe for them to call. And we know we're very concerned with the added stress that the pandemic has placed on survivors. Research has shown that stress can increase the risk of domestic violence for those who are vulnerable. So people now that are losing their jobs, there's loss of income, kids are staying at home, there's food insecurities. All of these conditions can intensify the stress in the home where violence has already existed. And as you can imagine, how an already fragile situation can quickly escalate into a violent and dangerous one. And so right now, escape options are limited for women during the pandemic. What we're hearing, if they're at home, we're hearing of situations where they're afraid to leave their homes because they're afraid of getting infected by COVID. Usually when someone leaves the relationship, they may do so when the abuser is at work. Well, now they might be all together at home all the time. Shelters might be at capacity, and again, women might just be afraid to be leaving for fear of being infected. Economic stress, as you can imagine, can also affect a survivor's ability to leave because they rely on their abuser for financial support. And during this uncertain time, like the current crisis that we're in, it could really cause women to feel like they are losing control. And so all of these reasons have really amplified the domestic violence crisis and increased the pressure on women. We also are helping victims of sex trafficking. We're extremely concerned that with school closures, kids and teenagers spending more time online, that they too may be more vulnerable to sexual exploitation. In fact, recent international reports have indicated an increase in online activity related to grooming children for sexual abuse. Studies have also shown that 9 out of 10 children right now are currently in lockdown around the globe. And we're very concerned about that there's no options for them to perhaps report any abuse with someone they trust, like a doctor or a school teacher or a therapist. So all of these reasons, all of this situation has really impacted victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and sex trafficking. And while we know the focus right now is on preventing COVID-19, we are so grateful for webinars like the one we have right now to really shine the light on vulnerable populations that are going through challenging times during the pandemic. So the needs for survivors have always been great. They're overwhelming right now. Some of the services that the Family Justice Center provides are comprehensive services. So survivors might not only need a restraining order, but they might also need assistance in finding emergency housing. They may want counseling to address compacted trauma or a safety plan to stay safe. At our center, we can help the survivor establish goals, options, and a plan to stay safe, obviously with their input and in taking into consideration their personal circumstance. We focus on their needs and let them lead to empower them. We work collaboratively with numerous government organizations. Some of our partners are San Diego Volunteer Lawyers Program, SAY San Diego, and Immigration Center for Women and Children. You might recognize a few of these: Palomar Health and the county's Health and Human Service Agency, and the San Diego Police Department Domestic Violence Unit. So we have all of these services on site where people can get counseling, domestic violence advocacy, perhaps assistance with early Head Start programs, although right now that's been on pause because the schools are closed. Healthy relationship information: what is domestic violence, what is sex trafficking, and also some of the new services that we're providing is help with unemployment. We're hearing a lot of people are losing their jobs and they need cash resources. So comprehensive solutions are really important to helping survivors to prevent and address these societal issues. It's not just training law enforcement or creating prevention programs or providing services for victims. All of these have to be done at the same time in order for us to stop the violence before it starts. But we also recognize that we are able to do our work because of the laws like what Ann mentioned, the Violence Against Women Act. And so for the last 25 to 26 years, since 1994, this landmark legislation has provided $1.6 billion towards investigation and prosecution of violent crimes against women, which is absolutely amazing and much needed to fund programs like the Family Justice Center, Rape Crisis Centers, and other organizations, nonprofits, that could help create programs for victims and survivors. And with each reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, it has continued to evolve to now protect immigrant survivors and provide legal aid for survivors of domestic violence. These are services that are a must for victims and survivors. As you can tell, this is a life and death situation for many. And through the good work of the groups represented here on this webinar and throughout the county, we can continue to do this important work. So thank you very much. Thank you, Ann, for the opportunity to present, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Yvette. And let's move on to the next slide. I just want to give a little commendation to Nancy Pelosi, our Speaker of the House. She was instrumental in making sure that the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act was written into law back in 2009. She really created the Recovery Act that came out of the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. And she was probably the force behind getting the Affordable Care Act enacted. So she's been working hard for women's issues, women's rights, since she arrived at the House of Representatives. And she's just been an amazingly strong woman to work on behalf of all of us, not just women and children, but all of us. So let's move on now and hear from our next speaker. And I'll just briefly introduce Bettina Hausmann. She is a Chief of Staff at the Office of the President and CEO of Project Concern International. Bettina actually grew up in East Germany, and so her early childhood was shaped by the Cold War era politics and living life behind the Iron Curtain. She spent her early year, which was shaped by the Cold War era politics, and these personal experiences resulted in her strong sense of community and the understanding of the importance of collective memory, culture conflict, and peace. She's a frequent delegate to United Nations high-level plenary sessions and panels worldwide. She attended the historic UN conference Rio plus 20, that gave birth to the Global Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. She is a subject matter expert on the Sustainable Development Goals, and recently she consults with the city of San Diego on localizing these global goals to achieve truly transformative, inclusive, and sustainable development outcomes. An innovative and energetic leader, Bettina earned university degrees in political science and international relations. She lives with her partner here in San Diego, her husband, Alan, and is actively engaged as a board member of countless organizations that champion an understanding of global citizenship and social justice. She is a representative to the United Nations Economic and Social Council. She's the regional representative from Southern California to the UNA USA National Council, and vice president resource development for UNA USA Southern California Division. Did I mention she's president of the United Nations Association here in San Diego, the San Diego chapter? Thank you, Bettina, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Can I share my screen with everyone? Thank you very much. I will. My apologies. I'm truly thankful for being here, in particular, following such incredibly dedicated activists within the women movement, and providing a little bit of input on, or broad input, truly an overview on the Sustainable Development Goals as these fit into the women agenda and the women movement in itself. I too want to first off really provide a disclaimer. I do not represent Project Concern International, my employer, but rather this is a representation of me as the president of the UN Association here in San Diego, and my personal opinion, of course. So anything I'm representing here or showcasing here is solely my own, and this of UN Association San Diego, and by no means represent Project Concern International. We really have seen through the prior presentation quite a range of where have we started, how did we influence the agenda, where are still the shortcomings, and what else needs to be done. So 2020 is truly a incredible moment, a galvanizing moment actually, because as we learned, it's the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And truly 2020, I would say it's the moment for global mobilization on insisting finally to achieve human rights of all women. So coinciding with the 25th anniversary, it's also other great moments in the 21st century women's rights movements. And we're celebrating this year the 20th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, the 10th anniversary of UN Women's establishment as the global champion for the empowerment of women and girls. And we do celebrate the 5th anniversary of the Global Sustainable Development Goals, also known as SDGs. Now, I'm unfamiliar and unsure how much of you are actually familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, with the SDGs. So allow me to provide a really broad overview on, and the emphasis is on broad, on the global concept of sustainable development, and then link it to the women's rights movement specifically. This image probably many of us will remember. It is truly the first visualization of Earth from space. It's taken 1972 by Apollo 17 crew members, coined Blue Marble. And it's one of the most widely distributed photographic images in existence. It shows for the very first time in human history how the world, Earth, really fits in a broader system of our universe, of our galaxies. It shows its fragility. And this really was the basis of a growing understanding on sustainability and the need on sustainability. And that indicates also in the passing years, the increase on publications on the subject on sustainability and also the increased public discourse thereof. Subsequent also the understanding, how do we do business? How do we sustain a development or a growth that truly ensures our survival? Here's a butterfly effect, as we know, we always refer or mainly refer to when we're talking about different impacts, our local actions, how that has a global impact. So sustainable development is a paradigm, an overarching paradigm of the United Nations, and truly first conceptualized in 1987 with the Brundtland Commission report. And the Brundtland Commission report has defined this sustainable development as a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Though it's conceptualized in 1987, it was, however, not formalized in a global approach until the late 1990s, and that's with the implementation of the Millennium Development Goals. And I don't want to go too much into the history of the Millennium Development Goals. It is, however, truly something that reshaped the UN Development Agenda in its 8 comprehensive goals around poverty reduction and other social goals. And it was implemented in 2000 for a 15-year time frame with completion of 2015. When 2015 deadline approached, in 2012, the UN conducted its conference in Rio de Janeiro, the Rio +20, where these 8 goals really served as the foundation for a collective discussion that really can most certainly be described as a historic moment in the UN history. And why is that? It is truly that it was recognized the limits of these 8 Millennium Development Goals. They did not comprehensively address the massive economic and socioeconomic challenges that we collectively faced, particularly as we're talking about sustaining human life on Earth through collective actions. Just as a reminder, the butterfly effect. So this historic moment, as we say, it's truly because it's the birthplace of the Sustainable Development Goals. Through the theme, the future we want, all of us attendees, and I include myself as I was privileged to be able to represent not only the UN Association, but also the San Diego community at this really groundbreaking conference. And it's groundbreaking because for the first time in history did the UN include all spheres of society, all stakeholders, from the public space to the private industry to civil society, and all of us met with decision makers from countries, policy makers. And this was truly something where we all came together to discuss, what is it? What do we want to see for the future to come? Achieved by 2030, we really looked into what comes after the Millennium Development Goals that were completed by 2015. How can we make this a comprehensive and inclusive process? So the discussion started about to really realize about we have a shared humanity, we are one human race, and discussion about how do we conceptualize the collective future that we need in order to survive as humankind. We back then already started to realize Earth can live without us, but we can't live without the Earth. So how did we conceptualize this future we want? As I said, we realized it's a shared responsibility, so we have a shared future. It's a true the Sustainable Development Goals are a true blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all of us. It's ambitious, and it says to leave no one behind. This is truly the mantra of the campaign, leave no one behind. And it's a set of 17 objectives, which are called the Sustainable Development Goals, embedded in a much bigger agenda called the 2030 Agenda, or Agenda 2030, meaning achieved in 2030. But aside from the Sustainable Development Goals, there's a comprehensive other mechanisms and campaigns that have to be accompanying the SDGs for a fully, wholly, a holistic approach on sustainable development and the assurance of humanity. So let's look at the SDGs. Here we have 17 Sustainable Development Goals outlined, starting from no poverty, going through 17 partnerships for the goals. They're aspirational, and they are a commitment to address a challenge. These are accompanied, each single goal has targets, and each target has a indicator, one or more indicators. So it's a total of, 17 goals, a total of 169 targets that outline an action. So it has to be specific, measurable, and time-bound. And we have each of the goals accompanied also as with one, each target, my apologies, for one or more indicators, a total of 230 indicators. And that is truly a metric to measure progress. So helps us with accountability. Again, 17 goals, 169 targets, 230 indicators. Sounds daunting. I will get to it, why this is so comprehensive later on in the presentation, so please bear with me. SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, or the agenda, is truly designed for global actions. And again, it was born out of what is arguably the most inclusive process in the history of the UN. As I mentioned, all spheres of society were included, and reflects substantial input from all sectors. And that really means we all have a stake in it to achieve it by 2030. These goals are universally applicable, and that means to developing and developed countries alike. Governments are expected to translate these into national action plans, policies, initiatives, so localizing these to reflect the different realities and capacities that countries possess. So we really acknowledge every country has a different capacity. So these goals, targets, and indicators should also reflect the potential discrepancies from country to country, from culture to culture. You may have seen this also laid out as a wheel. Why do we lay it out as a wheel? It truly symbolizes the interconnectedness of these goals. They're strongly interconnected with one another. Let's just look into one of, or a few of these when we're talking about specifically poverty, which is goal number 1 right here, poverty. Poverty, as we know, can lead to hunger, which is goal number 2, and malnutrition, which then leads to health problems. In goal number 3, health problems prevent children from completing their education, in goal number 4, and adults also from getting their jobs potentially here when you're as a young child are unable to go and get an education, so it will influence also your job and your future in terms of job market. So as you can see, really these are really building on one another and concluding each other as well. So it is truly a link between. That means that we cannot see them in separate or in separation to one another, but as a puzzle. And it cannot be completed without all of the pieces. So let's zero in on women's rights and empowerment within the SDGs specifically. one of really the major underlying and most critical goals for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals is goal number 5, the achievement of gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls. So why is it critical? This one has a true positive cascading effect on the achievement of all other SDGs. So which other SDGs may that influence? It influences, as we talked about, quality of education, right? Access to equal quality education. We have that in the US as it is anywhere else in the world. All of us share the same challenges. Ending poverty in all its form everywhere. We know women in particular are vulnerable to poverty. Access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, modern energy for all. Here in the US, we have pockets as well that have this challenge. Reduce inequality within and among countries, also in our own countries and states and nations. Ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Mentioned the cascading effect of education, poverty, and hunger, achieve food security, improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. Ensure availability to clean water and sanitation. COVID and prior pandemics that we had within San Diego, we can certainly also relate that this is happening in our own backyards. Promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. We heard prior also the achievements in equal pay. And not finally, but more inclusive and importantly, women in climate action, take urgent actions to combat climate change and its impact. Let's focus on climate action specifically. With the 2030 deadline of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, we're approaching the 2030 deadline so quickly. It is only a few years out. The fight against climate change is truly intensifying each year. We already see some of the devastating effects on climate change. We have the floods, hurricanes, and here in California in particular, wildfires. Women are the most vulnerable in this situation. We face maximum risks due to our socioeconomic status. With over 70% of women living in poverty, we are disproportionately affected by extreme weather events, loss of agriculture productivity, and destruction of life and property. And I go on, all of which stem really from climate crisis. For practical and effective climate change mitigation, we must unleash the knowledge and capability of us as women. We have the knowledge and understanding of what is needed to adapt to changing environment circumstances in order to determine practical solutions. But we still remain a largely untapped resource. And that's partially due to existing biases, restricted land rights, lack of access to training, technology, financial resources, and limited access to political decision-making due to underrepresentation, as we heard also earlier in the presentations. To find sustainable solution, it is really critical to recognize the important contributions of women as decision makers, caretakers, stakeholders, experts, and educators across all sectors. And that's truly why the SDGs are so powerful, as it addresses these aspects. And just to name a few that are leading the way in not only climate change advocacy, but also in crafting sustainable long-term solution, Christina Figueres, Franny Armstrong, and Greta Thunberg, to just name a few. One of the most potent tools for increasing the effectiveness of us women in climate change mitigation is renewable energy. And I'm sure some of you were wondering, why is that so important when I showed the cascading effect of goal number 5. It can help transform the lives of improving our health, women's health, providing us with better livelihood prospects, improve education and opportunities. In fact, it offers us many entrepreneurial avenues for further deployment of renewable energy, which in turn mitigates carbon emissions. Particular rural women will be primarily beneficiaries of this effort. When we look into examples in Africa, for instance, renewable energy is increasing women's relevance in society. It shields them from harmful health effects, be it indoor pollution through cook stove, cooking within the house. And with that, it makes women a true agent of climate change mitigation, just through involvement in renewable energy deployment. Excuse me. Women bring more empathy and inclusiveness in their advocacy and problem solving. I know we all know that. And with that, we enhance efficacy as sustainably leaders, but we have to become these leaders. The World Economic Forum on global gender gap actually found that a nation's competitiveness in the long term depends significantly on whether and how we educate and utilize women, and whether women have the same rights, responsibilities, and opportunities as men do. Women-led self-help groups, for instance, in Africa, mobilize funds for water and sanitation. That really create an important component of sustainability. And there are plenty other examples of women everywhere leading the way for and towards a sustainable future. I'm just choosing Africa specifically as we're talking about agriculture and climate change mostly impacted in that region. Gender equality by 2030 requires urgent actions, as we heard also from earlier presentation, to eliminate many root causes of discrimination that are still curtailing our rights as women in private and public spheres. We heard also from Dee and Anne on specific legislation to violence against women, the right to vote, and there's still so much to be done. At the national and subnational level, effective policies, projects, and programs for gender equality must really be crafted to ensure equal space and resources for women and men alike to participate in climate change decisions. So women in climate change decision is truly crucial, as there should be also a climate change gender action plan that invests in multi-stakeholder, multi-sectorial, and participatory integration of gender-related concerns. At the same time, build on the capabilities and unique knowledge and perspective of women. So that not only to build our, meaning women's climate resilience, but also make us active, an active agent of mitigation. So to reiterate, or to bring it back to the beginning, women's equality and empowerment is one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, with goal number 5. But also it's an integral part to all the dimension of inclusive and sustainable development. In short, all the SDGs depend on achieving goal number 5, gender equality. The links between the goals mean that we cannot see them in separation, apologies, to one another, but as a puzzle as we outlined. So here you can see a puzzle, and you know that the puzzle cannot be complete without all of its pieces. So I mentioned there are 17 goals, there are so many indicators, and there are also targets. I often get the question, A, why is it so many? Why don't we put this down to 3, 4, 5, or 8 as we had with the Millennium Development Goals? Again, we realized there's an incredible challenge that we all face in each country, no matter where we live across the continents. With that, there's a complexity because societies are made of human human are complex, societies are complex. So you cannot make a complex matter really boiling it down to 3 things only and try to solve it. It is complex, that's why it's so many. Now, are there any reasoning why we have so many colors? There truly isn't. The colors are rather alongside the spectrum, really to highlighting simply a kaleidoscope, if you will, of different issues and representing somewhat the true facets of us being different and yet collectively working to collectively. So gender equality and empowerment, as she's talked about for all women and girls, is not only considered within the Agenda 2030 or the Sustainable Development Goals. It truly also has been addressed, as we heard, in all different forums that preceded the SDGs. The need to speak with one voice is one thing that really transcends everything, right? So how do we get involved, and how can we ourselves not lose track of what still needs to be done, and how can we empower us, even if we can't participate? Who would speak on our behalf? Women's Major Group, I'm not sure if you have heard about them. They were created actually in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. They officially participate in the UN processes on sustainable development, while also particularly connecting and collaborating with the United Nations Environmental Program since 1996. So just a few years after their establishment. So that's why we really talked a little bit more about climate change, in addition, of course, it to be the surviving moment in our history to move on climate actions. The Women Major Group really facilitates civil society, it's active participation. So it's a participatory forum where anyone can actually get involved in. They provide participation, speaking, proposal submission, access to documents within this global forum of the United Nations, as well as development of specific sessions that are surrounded on the rights of women and women empowerment. Their mandate is on sustainable development concerns directly as it relates to Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development Goals. It also facilitates through the high-level political forum, which is a key space for follow-up and review on the international realm. Self-organized, as I mentioned, really participatory, and if anyone is interested as a group, as an organization to join, it promotes human rights-based sustainable development with a specific focus on women's human rights, empowerment of women, and gender equality. And it aims to cooperate closely with other women's major groups and on climate, on biodiversity, disaster risk reduction, cities, financing for development, also the Commission on the Status of Women, as we heard Dee speaking about this year's CSW. That is one of the big and good forums. And then, of course, overarching on a UN level, it's UN Women that has been, as I mentioned, also is celebrating its 10 years anniversary this year, dedicated solely to gender equality and the empowerment of women as a global champion for women and girls. It was established to accelerate the progress of meeting the needs worldwide on gender equality. And a few of the campaigns, as you may know from UN Women, is She for He campaign, the Orange, the World, which is specifically end violence against women and girls, and prior mentioned the Commission on the Status of Women Forum, through which UN Women also actively participates and shapes the agenda. Another one, which I personally really am excited about, is generation equality. And that is a global intergovernmental and intergenerational campaign to bring women's rights and empowerment to the forefront. And it also is very inclusive, as it has its foot into the private sector, the non-governmental and civil society sector, And this year, in fact, in May, it would have met in Mexico for the first time to talk about generation equality as an instrument for really creating the Beijing Platform for Action as a more cross or intergenerational platform. The campaign is hoped to galvanize attention and action on key issues that also include equal pay, equal sharing of unpaid care and domestic work, an end to sexual harassment, all forms of, in all its forms of violence against women, healthcare services that respond to their needs, and equal participation, economic and political life and decision making. So I'm almost coming to an end, and I'm sorry if it's been a little bit too lengthy for some of the slides. To really bring it back to the leave no one behind, the endeavor to protect the earth is really to serve the survival of humankind, as we really learned that the earth will be there without us later on. It will recover from whatever we bring onto it. It's really us that needs the collective effort for us to leave no one behind, to actually remain on this planet, to prosper on this planet. And gender equality is a prerequisite for this new world order, as it needs to include women, and we need to lead the way. We need to capitalize on the caregiving, on educating and nursing. A female architect said, and I found it very interesting, when it was about architecture and bringing nature in aspects into the architecture, by thinking about how to bring nature into the architecture, she said, really rethinking it, it demands of us for the first time that we actually mother nature. Women's empowerment and gender equality have a catalytic effect, as we talked about, on achievement of human development, good governance, sustained peace, harmonious dynamics between environment and human population. And I really want to remind us, we as women, we bear and rear children. So we carry huge responsibility. After all, it is us that give birth to the world. So it's truly time that we take the initiative to push ourselves on the negotiation table and make decisions for our collective future. So it's really paramount that we internalize this responsibility for us and our children to empower each other. We, as this webinar is about, we've come a long way, but we're not there yet. So thank you so much for the opportunity to bring the Sustainable Development Goals and the women empowerment and women equality to this forum today. Thank you.
Thank you, Bettina. I think there's one more slide left, and we'll pretty much conclude our presentations and be open for questions. So maybe Kim could put up the very last slide.
And while Kim is putting that slide up, you can go on your Q&A down on the bottom of your screen and submit some questions that we'll take up after Anne finishes up.
As you all know, we've created a He for She program at the United Nations, and that's to encourage all men to step forward and say they're feminists, and they all agree with the equal rights and opportunities for all of us. We also have the Me Too campaign that was created in 2017, followed by What's Up. We've had women's marches beginning in 2017, and those have become very important to all of us in promoting our endeavors. Now, what's left for us to do? Now, I've shown on the left a picture of the Republicans in our Senate. There are only 9 women in the Republican delegation. But my point being that there's been a holdup in our US Senate, primarily related to the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act. It has been held up in our Senate, the reauthorization. It's been held up for over a year. Dianne Feinstein, Senator, has been trying to bridge this so that we can reauthorize that. The main issue is the National Rifle Association. The act has been reauthorized to include that people who are charged with committing violence against women should not be given a permit to own a gun. So the National Rifle Association is holding up the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act. And we must do all we can to stop this. That needs to be reauthorized. We need to ensure that the Equal Rights Amendment is placed in our Constitution, the 28th Amendment. And that's being held up in the Department of Justice by the Office of Legal Counsel. And William Barr is also against including the Equal Rights Amendment in our Constitution. We need to fight this. It has been ratified by 38 states. It needs to be in our Constitution. We also want to have CEDAW as part of our ratified treaties in our country. And CEDAW, it needs to be ratified. And the last time it was presented was back in 1997 on the floor of the US Senate. It was blocked. And then George W. Bush came into office and he did not put it out as an important issue for him. President Obama urged the Senate to ratify CEDAW, but it wasn't again. So again, it sits unratified. And perhaps the next time we have an election in this country, the president will want it ratified and we can get it ratified through the US Senate. Another issue that is important is pay equity. We need to push for that. That's important to all of us. And what are we going to do about Roe v. Wade? We cannot allow that to go away. It won't go away in California, but we need to protect our sisters in other states. So these are the key issues that we've been talking about, issues that we can really try to have an impact by talking with our senators and making sure the ERA is added to our Constitution. The Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act is finally reauthorized. We also need to try to push for CEDAW to get that into our set of treaties that we've all ratified. We need to continue working on pay equity. It dates back to Susan B. Anthony, 1848. Come on, what's the problem? So those are some of the key issues, and I'm sure others should be also placed on our to-do list. So let's turn it back to Lori and see if we have any comments from people tuning in.
Thank you, Anne. Yeah, I really appreciate the structure of this presentation as you've pulled it together, and I'm very grateful for our panelists, our guests, Bettina Hausmann, Dr. D. Aker, Yvette Lopez-Cooper. It's just been very informative, and I really appreciate, and I'm sure the rest of our attendees do as well, the depth of knowledge that you've all shared with us today. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. One was an actual email question that came in prior to today's event, and I want to ask that one first. And Anne, I'm going to ask these questions, and you can decide whether or not you want to answer them, or you can pass it to one of our panelists. So the first question is, have you had a chance to review the recommendations in the March 25th report recommending that women also be required to register for selective service at age 18? If so, your opinion regarding what pro or con on this recommendation means for equality? It's not the draft, it's merely registering in the selective service like all 18-year-old men are required to do. So, Anne, do you have any comment, or would you like to pass to our panelists the question about requiring young girls at age 18 to register for selective service, just as we do our young men?
Yes, I'd like to respond to that by saying I don't think anyone should have to respond, and be eligible for the draft. We no longer need a draft. We have a volunteer military service. There's no need for a draft. I'm sorry, for men or women. Would any
Right.
of the other panelists like to chime in? Dee?
You'll need to unmute yourself.
I'm not,
Thank you.
is that good?
Yes.
No?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that Ann and I would disagree slightly on this. And in principle, I don't like the idea of anybody being conscripted into military. On the other hand, what militaries can do and can become has been demonstrated by having women go into things like women in peacekeeping with a totally different orientation. So I do think there's value. One, it shows that there's equality, that you're both going to have to go if, you know, some crisis comes. But more importantly, I think it brings a dimension into the whole concept of what you can do. What is the purpose of having a group of people who are trained and specifically to help in a situation that becomes, you know, catastrophic or violent?
Okay, let's move on to the next question.
Okay, here's one. It says, thanks for a great discussion. In my mind, the 2016 election of Donald Trump expressed a backlash against changing roles and increased power for women. The continued battle to retain abortion accessibility in the United States also reflects that. How should women activists address the feelings and values of both women and men who feel safer with traditional, so-called traditional roles and power for women? How do we get their votes in November 2020?
Who would like to respond? Yvette?
Sure. And I think that women offer a different perspective and thought on many things. And as we saw in this presentation with the panelists on the different topics, throughout the years and decades, women have increasingly had a larger presence in society, whether it's the military or healthcare, or in the legal field or in international arenas. And I think it's really important to continue to provide those opportunities for women of all ages to get involved. VAWA, the reauthorization of VAWA, I was very happy to see that on the slide, because VAWA is such an important legislation, and it's critical for Congress to reauthorize it, as it has provided a step forward to provide effective interventions and protections for survivors. So as more awareness starts to develop through different movements like the Me Too movement and empowers people to come forward, the demand on services is only going to continue to grow. So I think as we provide those opportunities, it's also very important to be able to remember that organizations need the funding to continue to meet the demands of their programs.
Let's take the next question.
Well, the next question actually does allude to the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act, and it's a question regarding the NRA's opposition, as you mentioned, Anne, as far as the assailants or people being charged with violence against women. And the question is essentially, could that be changed to convicted of instead of charged with, to get that reauthorization passed?
I think that's probably what the two senators are working on. Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa and Dianne Feinstein from California. I think that's probably what they're going to have to do to make it acceptable for those people who really align themselves with the National Rifle Association. So that indeed might have to be the solution to getting this important act reauthorized.
Okay.
Anyone else? Okay, next question.
Okay, we have time for maybe one more. Here's one that says, one thing that is often mentioned about the early days of the women's movement is that it was not very inclusive. And so just, Anne, I know that you covered the early days of women's rights and the suffrage movement. Is there anything you would like to add to that or maybe talk about how it can become more inclusive going forward?
Well, I think the movement is definitely very much inclusive. And I think that's the drive of all organizations to be truly diverse, to be inclusive, to engage in intersectionality, you name it, we all want to be inclusive. And as Bettina said, no one needs to be left behind. We're all trying to save our planet, to try and create a society that we all would love. But I think we need to add something from Bettina on this issue.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
It's pertaining to how can we really be inclusive? In the past, it's been, you know, the suffrage movement was started by white women, probably elite women in our society. But how do we include all women, all people?
Yeah, thank you for repeating. And in fact, actually, I'm watching right now Mrs. America. It's currently really, I mean, it's fascinating because I grew up in East Germany. So for me, this was never a question on equal rights. So it's really fascinating to see that aspect. And yes, I did see that too, that the inclusion wasn't lesbians or at that point were not really included. And also the African Americans had their own movement in that regard, right? I do think we still have not overcome that either, because it keeps changing the landscape. For instance, when we're talking about non-gender or non-binary gender identifications, right? There's things that are so complex, and I'm really happy that this raises sort of to the level of conscience for us as we're getting more and more in these discussions to be more sensitive on the language in itself. When what I really loved was in New Zealand, and I believe in Australia, similar as in Canada, when we're talking about husband, wife, or spouse, it's really deferred to as partner, which I personally really love the expression of "this is my partner," because that is so inclusive in so many ways. Doesn't show possessiveness, as we're talking about really how do we distinguish ourselves from traditional ways of gender identification, right, on gender roles, because that also drives, as we know, language drives realities. Language really will drive us. How do we see initiatives? How do we see opportunities? So the inclusion is really starting with us, right, with each of us. And as we also saw at the very beginning and continue still to see with women, we are our own worst enemies, right? We need to pull other women up, and we have to control language. We have to really open up our forums and the way we're addressing people, even how we advertise, right? Do we show pertaining only white females, or how do we address this? This is really much coming back to changing our own lens, our perception to be more inclusive, and putting ourselves into other people's shoes to be more aware of how do we create these spaces of inclusion.
Okay, Dee?
Yeah, I would hope that we could look back at what I tried to show when we did that Fourth World Conference. That was the transition, a possibility. It's true. In the early days, it was so hard to be inclusive. And the women sent to the First World Conference on Women were the spouses of important men. It's not the case anymore. Women are leading. We have to give credit and recognize it. And the impact over time has been really tremendous. And I think that there's been a rapid acceptance. I mean, granted, the first time I ever saw lesbians at an international conference was in Beijing. And it was long before we talked about it here. But I think it's very important to say that we have come a long way, we're on our way, and we just continue to really point out what's working, how we've come together and built things that work and decrease problems. So thanks.
And Yvette, would you like to have the last word?
Well, thank you. I would just echo what the panelists said, and I think it's extremely important to be inclusive. As we've seen with domestic legislation and international legislation, we are able to shift societal responses to make societies more inclusive. So, for example, VAWA changed public perception of treating intimate partner violence as a private family matter and more of a societal matter. So that's what I would have to add to it.
And I'm now going to thank the League of Women Voters for giving us the opportunity to talk and talk and talk.
We are delighted. We are delighted to have you. It was a very informative discussion, and we very much appreciate your time and your authority in this matter, and sharing your experience and your knowledge with us. We'd like to ask our attendees to involve themselves in your organizations. All of the organizations represented here are willing to take your donations and contributions and your support in any way that you would like to share it. So feel free to, including the League of Women Voters, feel free to come to our website and be a member. You can join. I know there was a high school student who asked about becoming involved in women's rights. The League offers a free membership for students, and I'm sure that the Women's Museum and all the other organizations represented here will also be happy to help steer anybody on this teleconference and video conference in a direction that would allow them to be an activist for women's rights. So with that, I would like to conclude today's presentation. Thank you all again to our panelists for participating and sharing your knowledge. And thank you for the attendees for your generosity with your time and your questions to us. And we look forward to seeing you all again at the next event. So thanks all.